All right, let's picture this. Imagine a giant, high-stakes tug-of-war playing out right at the heart of our country. On one end of the rope, you've got the federal government in Ottawa, and on the other, you have all 10 provincial governments pulling back. So what are they fighting over? Well, it's the power to make the laws that shape pretty much every part of our lives. And that brings us to this huge, fundamental question, right? In a country as big and diverse as Canada, from coast to coast to coast, who actually gets to call the shots? Who makes the rules? The answer, it turns out, is woven right into the blueprint of how Canada was built. So here's what we're going to break down in this explainer. We'll look at Canada's big power play, meet the two main teams, see what happens when their powers overlap, and how the courts step in as the referee. Then we'll dig into the actual constitutional rulebook they use. And finally, we'll talk about why this whole tug-of-war is so important for all of us. So, how does Canada try to solve this massive question of who gets the power? Well, the answer is a system called federalism. You have to go all the way back to 1867 to get this. The founders of Canada basically decided, hey, let's not put all our eggs in one basket. So instead, they divided up the power to make laws. Some powers went to the big, central, national government, and others went to the regional, provincial governments. They wrote it all down in the Constitution, creating two big lists of responsibilities, hoping they had all their bases covered. Okay, so let's properly meet the two teams pulling on this constitutional rope. You've got Team Federal and you've got Team Provincial. And you can really see the division of labor here. Team Federal, that's Parliament in Ottawa, they handle the big picture, national stuff. The military, banking, our criminal laws, and things that cross provincial lines like railways and pipelines. Meanwhile, Team Provincial is focused much more on your day-to-day life. Your local hospital, your kids' schools, property rights, even how your own city or town is run. It's a foundational split by design. But, of course, it's never quite that neat and tidy, is it? The real action starts when the lines between these powers get blurry. Sometimes a single issue lands in a constitutional gray zone, and both teams grab the rope, insisting it's theirs to control. So to deal with these messy gray zones, the courts came up with a pretty clever idea called the double aspect doctrine. It's basically a way of saying, look, some issues are just too complicated to fit neatly into one box. They can have two different sides, or aspects, one that's federal and one that's provincial. And that means both governments can make laws about it, as long as they're doing it for their own valid reasons. Let's make that real for a second. Think about dangerous driving. Is it a crime? A threat to public safety that should be handled nationally? Absolutely. That falls under federal criminal law. But is it also a matter of just managing the flow of traffic on a provincial highway? You bet. That's a provincial power. The double aspect doctrine just says, hey, why can't it be both? So when the tug-of-war gets really intense and the two teams are at a standstill, who steps in to blow the whistle and make the final call? Well, that's when the courts walk onto the field. They are the ultimate, impartial referees in this game. And the court's authority, it's not just something they made up. It comes directly from this incredibly powerful line in our Constitution. It says the Constitution is the supreme law. That means nobody is above it. Not the prime minister, not the premiers. And if any government passes a law that breaks the constitutional rules, the courts have the power to step in and say, nope, that law has no force or effect. Now, the courts don't just wing it when they make these massive decisions. They follow a very specific rule book, a set of legal tests or doctrines that they use to figure out which team has the right to make a particular law. This referee has three main tools in its kit. First, pith and substance, which is all about finding a law's main point. Second, interjurisdictional immunity, which builds a protective wall around certain powers. And third, federal paramountcy. That's the ultimate tiebreaker. So let's start with pith and substance. Sounds kind of weird, but it's the first question a court always asks. They look right past a law's official title and all the legal jargon to ask one simple question. What is this law really all about? What's its true purpose, its dominant feature? It's really a two-step process. First, the court figures out the law's pith and substance, its main point, by looking at what it's trying to do and what its effects are. Step two, they take that main point and they try to match it. Does it belong on Team Federal's list of powers or Team Provincial's? If the government that passed the law has that power on its list, the law is usually good to go.
Okay, the next doctrine in the rulebook is all about defense. It's called interjurisdictional immunity, and its whole job is to stop one level of government from seriously messing with the core business of the other.
Now, you might think this shield protects both sides equally, but in reality, it's almost always used to create a protective force field around core federal areas. It basically says that some things are so fundamentally federal that provincial laws just can't touch them. Period. So what's inside this protected federal bubble? Well, think about things like the inner workings of a national bank or railway, or the management of indigenous reserve lands, or even the location of a federal airport. The courts have said these things are part of the protected federal core, and provincial laws, even if they're otherwise valid, can't interfere. Okay, but what about the ultimate showdown? What happens when both the federal and provincial governments have passed perfectly valid laws, but those laws directly contradict each other? This brings us to the final and most decisive rule in the playbook: federal paramountcy. The rule here is simple, and it's absolute. If there is a genuine head-on conflict between a federal law and a provincial law, the federal law wins. The provincial law doesn't get erased forever, but it becomes inoperative. It essentially goes to sleep, just for as long as that conflict exists. But, and this is a really big but, the word conflict has a very specific legal meaning. It's not enough for the two laws to just overlap a little bit. A real conflict only happens in two scenarios. One, it's literally impossible for a person to obey both laws at the same time. Or two, following the provincial law would completely sabotage the entire purpose of the federal law. And this really is the bottom line. When push comes to shove in this constitutional tug of war, and there's a real conflict, Team Federal has the stronger grip on the rope. The federal law will always prevail.
So, I know this can all sound a little academic, constitutional doctrines, legal tests, but why should any of us care? Well, because this constant tug of war over who gets to make the rules has a direct impact on almost everything, from our healthcare and the environment to the economy and our fundamental rights.
And that leaves us with one final massive question. The people who wrote this rulebook back in 1867 weren't thinking about artificial intelligence or global pandemics or carbon taxes. These new challenges don't fit neatly into either team's list of powers. So how will this 150-year-old constitutional tug-of-war adapt to solve the problems of today and tomorrow? That's the billion-dollar question that will shape Canada's future. The tug-of-war is far from over.